Indigenous knowledge and the integration of knowledge systems towards a conceptual and methodological framework. Catherine A. Odora Hoppers. Indigenous knowledge systems, a profound challenge to human development in the 21st century. South Africa's drive for the development, promotion and protection of Indigenous knowledge systems, IKS, within which this initiative is located, comes at a time when major winds of change are blowing in the country. On the one hand, there are major transformation and democratization processes being implemented under the new dispensation. Several macro-level policies provide frameworks for understanding the equity, employment and development thrusts in government policies. For example, the Reconstruction and Development Program, RDP, the Policy for Growth, Equity and Reconstruction, GEAR, the National System of Innovation, and the African Renaissance. The latter, in particular, sets forth an agenda that combines identity reconstruction and innovation, human rights, sustainable development, and democratization in South Africa and throughout the African continent. The African Renaissance aims at building a deeper understanding of Africa, its languages, and its methods of development. It is a project that includes the rewriting of major tenets of history, both past and contemporary. IKSs thus posit tremendous challenges for the reconstruction and development of strategies in South Africa. Several global initiatives also underpin the need for renewed attention to IKSs. To begin with, the world stands at a crossroad in search of new human-centered visions of development in health, in preserving and conserving biodiversity, in human rights, and in the alleviation of poverty. All the agencies of the United Nations are seeking to promote paradigms of sustainable human development that build on knowledge resources that exist in communities. As a continent, Africa is seeking its own renaissance and seeking to establish the terms of its development. Despite the affluence that globalization has brought to a small minority, we live in a world in which subjection, suffering, dispossession, and contempt for human dignity and the sanctity of life are at the center of human existence. Emotional dislocation, moral sickness, and individual helplessness remain ubiquitous features of our time. Moreover, for a great majority of the population of Africa, the loss of cultural reference points has culminated in the fundamental breakdown of African societies, with dire consequences for the social and human development project as a whole. Finally, globalization is threatening the appropriation of the collective knowledge of non-Western societies into proprietary knowledge for the profit of a few. At the international level, key agencies of the United Nations, such as the World Health Organization, the United Nations Environmental Programme, the United Nations Development Programme, and the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, have conventions or mandates of various kinds on the issue of diversity, indigenous and traditional knowledge, and of the rights of indigenous people worldwide. The issue of diversity, and especially biodiversity, and the role of indigenous communities in the protection and utilization of the natural products around them were elucidated during the 1992 United Nations Conference on Environment and Development held in Rio de Janeiro. Also involved, playing an active though ethically unclear role, are the transnational corporations, with immense financial power but with short-term profit motives keen to exploit genetic and other resources from the so-called third world countries. The TNCs are protected by the agreements initiated at the Uruguay round, which led to the formation of the World Trade Organization. The WTO is the global trade police, interested in eliminating all trade barriers worldwide. However, it is also the WTO that legislates the idea of intellectual property rights in a manner that assumes individual ownership, a Western phenomenon, as a universal phenomenon, and excludes the notion of collectivity that characterizes ownership of IPRs in many societies in the Third World. The WTO is attempting to establish new regimes of intellectual property rights at a time when Third World countries are not at all prepared for this. Many developing countries still need to invest in the development of skills to manage IPRs and leverage its influence for the benefit of the poor. As it stands, too many existing IPR systems are focused on private ownership and are at odds with indigenous cultures that emphasize collective creation and ownership of knowledge. Present IPR systems encourage the appropriation of traditional knowledge for commercial use. Moreover, without the fair sharing of benefits with the holders of the knowledge. Current IPRs also violate indigenous cultural precepts by encouraging the commodification of such knowledge. There is therefore a serious need for innovation in the intellectual property regime itself. At the level of science, A recent cornerstone cue for change emanates from the UNESCO Declaration on Science and the Science Agenda Framework adopted in Budapest, Hungary. This declaration urged member countries to define a strategy to ensure that science responds better to society's needs and aspirations in the 21st century. It reiterated the need for political commitment to the scientific endeavor, and especially to make science more responsive and more inclusive. Science should become more accountable, more communicative, and more dialogical. The vision of science in the 21st century should be a science that can appreciate interconnectedness and interdependence, a science that can decipher the meaning of words like responsibility and ethics in the use of scientific knowledge, a science that can comprehend the fact that science is a product of culture or cultures, and that its diverse manifestations must be recognized, and a science that can be seen by all to be a shared asset. This declaration called for a drastic change in the attitude, methods, and approach in the scientific field, and to the problems of development, especially in the social and human dimension. Sciences, the document emphasized, must be put to work for sustainable development, and must thus transform itself and become inclusive of women and other forms of knowledge in terms of its culture of administration and operation. But most of all, it must take a stand on issues affecting global development, such as pollution, depletion of natural resources, poverty, and the widening disparities in well-being. Institutional development imperatives. It is with this in mind that South Africa needs to develop a corpus of academics and scientists who can act as catalysts and agents of change. Within their ranks, the process of the gradual transformation of scientific ethos, ethics, and practice should emerge, while developing a strong and committed system of protocols for developing and protecting indigenous knowledge systems, biodiversity, and especially the IPRs of local communities. It is crucial for institutions that engage with IKSs to develop an understanding of the relationship between science and the series of suppressed others, and the role of science in such suppression. Part of the legacy of colonialism and the science that accompanied it, that still lingers in academic practice in general, is that non-Western societies and the knowledges that sustain them are taken as obsolete. In the rush towards modernity, we, the newly modernized, have not wanted to give those on whom we have imposed the signifier of obsolescence a voice. In fact, as a group, victims are never part of scientific history or discourse. There is thus a need to open up new moral and cognitive spaces within which constructive dialogue between people and between knowledge systems can occur. The starting point for this is a realization that new directions in the philosophy and sociology of science are emerging today, not from the academia, but from questions raised by grassroots movements. The grassroots movements represent dissenting organic academia and raise issues that the universities are reluctant to confront. It is the grassroots movements and their determination of new directions in the philosophy and sociology of science that have constantly demonstrated that knowledge is an intrinsic part of democratic politics. It is through such voices that we have come to understand not only policy frameworks and the political economy of science, but also how the cosmology within which modern Western science was embedded could be a source of violence. It is by undertaking this work of reconnecting systems that questions of cosmology and political economy can be linked to democratic theory. This initiative is intended, therefore, to facilitate the development of community-conscious scientists and researchers across the natural and social sciences on the one hand, and help reshape the content of curricula at universities in South Africa on the other. Central to the endeavor will be to work towards improving the lives of holders of knowledge in the rural areas who have become subjected to epistemological disenfranchisement by the combination of colonial and apartheid practices buttressed by the attitudes, ethos, and practices of the scientific community. This should lead to high-level capacity building for critical analytical work, knowledge development, and strategic policy advice on crucial development issues in Africa and internationally. Even more urgent is the fact that some universities, university faculties, and individual academics are beginning to question the skewed knowledge production formats that undergird the curriculum of tertiary institutions. The relations between universities and communities are also coming under the spotlight, giving rise to the question of how universities perceive local communities. It is also quite apparent that the knowledge that has generally informed policy development in South Africa and most of the developing countries excludes IKS, thereby continuing to render people in rural areas in a deficit mode with acutely disempowering consequences. Formal research institutions should therefore demonstrate their readiness to work to the advantage of the holders of knowledge in rural communities and to facilitate their recognition. Where it is identified that particular communities are resource-rich but economically poor, concerted research and development interventions grounded in an IKS perspective should help to rapidly highlight the situation at community level and offer advice as to how government could and should act. Challenges to research and development strategies and perspectives. From an IKS perspective, research as we know it is intricately linked to European imperialism and colonialism. In many local communities, the word research conjures up silence and bad memories and raises smiles that are knowing and distrustful. The ways in which scientific research is implicated in the worst excesses of colonialism remains a powerfully remembered history for many of the world's colonized people in whose domain indigenous knowledge systems repose. It is a history that still offends our deepest sense of humanity. It galls indigenous communities that Western researchers and intellectuals can so glibly assume to know all that is possible to know of local people and systems on the basis of shallow altruism or brief encounters with some individuals. The Maori intellectual Linda Smith writes, "It appalls us that the West can desire, extract, and claim ownership of our ways of knowing, our imagery, the things we create and produce, and then simultaneously reject the people who created and developed those ideas, and seek to deny them further opportunities to be creators of their own culture, and deny them the validity of their own knowledge." This collective memory of imperialism has been perpetuated by the ways in which knowledge about indigenous people was collected, classified, and then represented to Western audiences, and then, through the eyes of the West, represented back to those who have been colonized. It is this circularity that is still perpetuated by most formal research institutions in South Africa. It is a Western discourse about the other that is supported by institutions, vocabulary, scholarship, doctrines, and research methods. It is here where formal scholarly pursuits of knowledge are intertwined with the anecdotal constructions of the other, that research becomes a significant battleground for the struggle between the interests and ways of knowing of the West and the interests and ways of knowing of indigenous people and communities that, for so long, could only survive in the underground trenches of epistemological resistance. In a decolonizing framework, therefore, deconstruction has a large intent. It consists of addressing social issues within a wider framework of self-determination and social justice. The simultaneous project is one of establishing new research protocols that are accepted for those research had prescribed as its subjects, and excavating the subjugated knowledges with a view to making them available in real time for present and succeeding generations. Research is thus not some innocent or distant academic exercise, but is recognized as an activity with intent. This intent must be made overt and explicit to those whom we have turned into the rats in our scientific cages. Recognizing innovation and creativity at community level. As Gupta emphasizes, a higher consciousness about what exactly is at stake here must develop. At the material level, it is clear, for instance, that there is a gross asymmetry in the rights and responsibilities of those who produce knowledge, particularly in the informal sector, and those who go about valorizing it in the formal sector. This brings to light the issue of the ethics of extraction and responsibility. It is also strongly felt that the notion is not true that research and development by small-scale firms or individual community-based scientists cannot generate globally valuable intellectual property. At the same time, it is important to note that while no claims exist that all problems can be solved better by local communities, some problems that they solve in a creative manner through their own genius indicate that there are niches that mainstream science and technology institutions have either failed to fill or have not yet even noticed. In that regard, there exists tremendous scope for complementarity between the knowledge systems, i.e. formal and informal, and for the reciprocal valorization of knowledge systems. It is also recognized that a major threat to sustainability of natural resources is the erosion of people's knowledge, and the basic reason for this erosion is the low value attached to it. The erosion of people's knowledge associated with natural resources is under greater threat than the erosion of the natural resources themselves. Questions therefore need to be asked as to why the most disadvantaged people have to carry the heaviest burden of maintaining genetic diversity for future generations. Indigenous herbalists, veterinary experts, and pastoralists know a lot about the habitats and life cycles of plants and animals and various other aspects of other resources. Yet efforts to build upon knowledge systems of people who have maintained their natural resources are, so far, quite inadequate. Language is another problem in revitalizing local communities. Writing in English, for example, has been recognized as valuable for connecting internationally, but there is an awareness that it alienates locally. The goal here is not only to feed back what as scientists we learn from local communities and individual innovators in their own language, but also to share with them what we learn from others, i.e. enhancing the public understanding of scientific developments. A strong view, therefore, needs to be taken of the unprofessional conduct on the part of scientists, especially the tradition of making local communities anonymous in scientific practice, even when these communities have divulged key information regarding certain plants or drugs. This must be brought to a rapid halt, and a change in the ethics of scientific practice should gradually impact on the basic tenor of academic discourse on local knowledge, and on IKS as a whole. A development imperative to emerge from these considerations is the issue of value addition. Value addition to indigenous knowledge will help local communities to coexist with biodiversity resources by reducing primary extraction and generating long-term benefits. From this perspective, local communities are termed knowledge-rich but economically poor. Any dynamic knowledge system, therefore, has to evolve through the continuance of traditional knowledge and contemporary innovations, and this should be pursued by individuals as well as communities. The aim is to connect creative people engaged in generating local solutions that are authentic and accountable, thus facilitating people-to-people learning. As scientific institutions, we should be seriously concerned with the ethics of knowledge extraction, its documentation, dissemination, and its incorporation into real-life products and services or policy framework. The search is therefore for a middle way in the dialogue and linkage between IKS and formal knowledge systems. At the same time, the discussion on biodiversity can only become authentic if we probe deep enough into the knowledge traditions of each part of the world to discover the roots of sustainable ethics. But this discovery requires preparing our minds for visions that collide with the dominant materialistic worldview. The existing epistemology relies excessively on the language and ethos of the elite, whose record of sharing their rent with providers of knowledge is not very honorable. When they plead for reforms, they advocate action by everyone else in the world, ranging from local governments to world bodies, but their own conduct and practices remain untouched by the logic of their appeal. With this in mind, it is urgent that a code of conduct be developed. The scientific community must, therefore, transform their knowledge, legitimation, and accreditation cultures in order to build linkages between excellence in formal scientific systems and innovations in informal knowledge systems, and thus create an inclusive knowledge network to link various stakeholders through applications of information technologies. IKS, towards a conceptual and analytical framework. Knowledge is a universal heritage and a universal resource. It is diverse and varied. The acquisition of Western knowledge has been and still is invaluable to all, but on its own it has been incapable of responding adequately in the face of massive and intensifying disparities, untrammeled exploitation of pharmacological and other genetic resources, and rapid depletion of the Earth's natural resources. For its part, IKSs represent both a national heritage and a national resource that should be protected, promoted, developed, and where appropriate, conserved. But it is also a resource that should be put at the service of the present and succeeding generations. By way of definition, the word indigenous refers to the root, something natural or innate. It is an integral part of culture. Indigenous knowledge systems refer to the combination of knowledge systems encompassing technology, social, economic, and philosophical learning, or educational, legal, and governance systems. It is knowledge relating to the technological, social, institutional, scientific, and developmental, including those used in the liberation struggles. The idea of indigenous knowledge as espoused within this framework, for instance, is not just about woven baskets, handicraft for tourist or traditional dances per se. Rather, it is about excavating the technologies behind these practices and artifacts, the looms, textile, jewelry, and brasswork manufacture, exploring indigenous technological knowledge in agriculture, fishing, forest resource exploitation, atmospheric and climatological knowledge and management techniques, indigenous learning and knowledge transmission systems, architecture, medicine, and pharmacology, and recasting the potentialities they represent in a context of democratic, equitable participation for community, national, and global development in real time. The questions and challenges to practice. The issue of IKSs posits profound challenges to contemporary practice, a few of which are listed below. The first relates to the knowledge generation and legitimation processes, such as the type of knowledge being generated in scientific institutions, the type of research questions being asked, and the existing rules and regulations governing legitimation and accreditation of scientific knowledge. The second relates to social and economic survival of resource-rich but economically poor local communities. How can the study and validation of IKS assist directly in the economic and socio-cultural empowerments of the communities? A third agenda that the integration of knowledge systems highlights is the need to explore deeper the interface between epistemology, diversity, and democracy, to explore the potential for true exchange and what Huntunji refers to as the reciprocal valorization among knowledge systems. Central to this is the need to establish knowledge as an intrinsic part of democratic politics. Fourthly, internal to the IKSs, there is a separate need to engage in its critical evaluation and careful validation, while recognizing its inner truths and coherence in order to facilitate its active reappropriation and authentication into current living research work. A fifth point, one of great importance for many Africans, is that it is strongly felt that the time has come to subject to direct interrogation the historical, scientific, and colonial discourses behind the semantic shift that turned the illiterate from someone ignorant of the alphabet to an absolute ignorant, pitting what is not written as thoughtless, as a weakness, and at its limit as primitivism, which has been central to the strategic disempowerment of African societies since the advent of colonialism. Sixth, in realizing the fundamental intolerance of modern science towards the legitimacy of folk or ethnic knowledges, coupled with our increasing inability to develop an ecologically coded society, engaging with IKS enables us to reopen crucial files that were summarily closed somewhere in the chaos and violence of colonialism. Colonialism remains a factor insofar as it provided the framework for the organized subjugation of the cultural, scientific, and economic life of many of the African continents and the Third World. This subjugation extended in a spectrum from people's way of seeing, their way of being, their way of negotiating life processes in different environments, their survival techniques, to technologies for ecologically sensitive exploitation of natural resources. All these knowledges were, en masse, rendered irrelevant to their use as millions of people became transmogrified by the combined advent of modern science and colonialism into an inverted mirror of Western identity, a mirror that belittled them and sent them to the back of the queue. Seventh, IKSs enable us to move the frontiers of discourse and understanding in the sciences as a whole, and to open new moral and cognitive spaces within which constructive dialogue and engagement for sustainable development and collective emancipation can begin. In effect, it makes it possible for us to clear space in order to enable new issues in science development to be generated and fostered, and thus determine new directions for the philosophy and sociology, as well as political economy of the sciences. Finally, IKSs enable us to re-establish science as the story of all animals, and not just of the lion, to develop a clearer sense of the ethical and judicial domain within which science works, and to begin to understand the political economy of othering. More importantly, IKSs humanize our practice and enable those silent witnesses of marginalization, i.e. those regarded as refractory to the scientific gaze, to become part of the empowering process, and strengthen their capacity to take an active part in questioning the competence and ethics of the professional expert, at the same time working to forge genuine partnerships and informed alliances for development. IKSs are characterized by their embeddedness in the cultural web and history of a people, including their civilization, and form the backbone of the social, economic, scientific, and technological identity of such people. It is these knowledges that are referred to as indigenous knowledges. They consist of tangible and intangible aspects that, in contemporary contexts, can be identified as those that have exchange value and that, with support, can be transformed into enterprises or industries, perpetuate cultural, scientific, philosophical, and technological knowledge that can provide the basis for an integrated and inclusive knowledge framework for a country's development, represent major socio-cultural institutions and organizational systems. These knowledges are rich and varied, ranging from soil and plant taxonomy, cultural and genetic information, animal husbandry, medicine and pharmacology, ecology, climatology, zoology, music, arts, architecture, social welfare, governance, conflict management, and many others. Their intrinsic efficiency and efficacy as tools for personal, societal, and global development must therefore be identified and accredited as necessary. It is this recovery of indigenous knowledges and the systems intricately woven around them that will enable the move towards a critical but resolute reappropriation of the practical and cognitive heritage of millions of people around the continent and elsewhere in the world. It is in turn the reappropriation of this heritage that may provide new clues and directions as to the visions of human society, human relations, sustainable development, poverty reduction, and scientific development, all of which cannot be resolved using the existing ethos in the Western framework alone. A focus on IPRs within IKSs will also enable the indigenous authorities and communities to publicly and legally lay claim to IPRs and copyright to the wide range of artistic, pharmacological, and other products currently being extracted largely without recompense. The development of new protocols for benefit sharing, value addition, and new ethics of extraction will further lead to the strategic revisiting of the adequacy of existing legal, educational, industrial, commercial, and other sectoral provisions currently under implementation, with a view to questioning the extent to which they are oriented to serving, promoting, developing, and protecting all sources of knowledge, and putting them to use for the benefit of all. In methodological terms, engaging with IKSs implies sensitization, empowerment, and restoration of holism and ethical practices, including spirituality, for individuals, systems, and institutions. It means going beyond the appraisals of the work of individual scientists, beyond the output of particular research teams, and the competitive acumen of individual research institutions, and reaching the point where it is possible to ask questions that can serve to recenter Africa and the Third World. An integrated policy project. IKS research can be taken as an integrated policy project. This concept, coined by Dr. Wim Hoppers of the Royal Netherlands Embassy, is used in selected projects that go beyond typical research to impact on policy, action, and empowerment dimensions, in that it seeks to explicate through research as it simultaneously impacts on ongoing thinking and practice. An integrated policy project usually contains several policy issues. In this case, key policy issues that an IKS study addresses include the interface between democracy, epistemology, and sustainable human development, the knowledge base informing policy, the knowledge legitimation and accreditation culture and procedures, the shortfalls in disciplinary arrangements in universities, especially their lack of responsiveness to diversity of knowing, seeing, and interpreting the world, introducing legislation on intellectual property in a context of cultural diversity on the one hand, and the forces of globalization on the other. Protection of indigenous technologies from one-sided exploitative extraction. Economic benefits of the reversal of ownership to indigenous communities of products that would otherwise be extracted unchecked by global multinational corporations. And the issue of human rights and identity, i.e. the right to be. Acknowledging that an initiative such as this one on IKSs cannot stand aloof from real-life situations, this research initiative aims to provide structural backup to the ongoing formulation of policies. This means that expertise on IKSs is put directly to task in support of various initiatives in policy formulation. In other words, this IKS project would enable the development of theoretical and conceptual frameworks, a language of articulation in this field, but at the same time help in developing operational strategies for input into policy development. In this way, one can see clearly how research can directly strengthen capacity building for policy work. Looking at the national scene in South Africa and the regional scene within the SADC, this initiative will provide a transdisciplinary and cross-sectoral national and regional framework within which policies and strategies can be developed. It will in particular bring together expertise in this area within the country, the SADC, the continent, the Third World, and internationally. The initiative also aims at fostering understanding of the interface between culture and science, culture and technology, sustainable human development, and the comprehensive development of human material and scientific resources in a manner that gives cognizance to the wisdom and authenticity of traditional practices, institutions, and knowledges. Moreover, it will provide a new basis for the generation of knowledge and a new consciousness in protecting intellectual property and other rights of those who have been ignored or taken for granted for so long. It is located within a critical humanist and post-positivist frame of reference, keeping the human being firmly at the center of the activity, fully aware that the technocratic approach to valuations contributes to the domestication of perceptions, and that what usually passes for value neutrality in reality conceals powerful but hidden conservatism. The notion of comparison in this study therefore seeks to bring perspectives and experiences from different contexts into a critical reflective dialogue on the tenets of thinking and practice, with a view to reconstructing or deepening the functioning of those tenets on the ontological, epistemological, and sociological levels. Creating a holistic knowledge framework for societal development. The challenge of creating an integrated and holistic knowledge framework for societal progress and development is not only real but also urgent. Holistic as opposed to mechanistic refers to an understanding of reality in terms of integrated wholes whose properties cannot be reduced to those of smaller units. The search for such a framework cannot be initiated purely because of economic austerity, cuts in welfare budgets, or for that matter because wafts of paternalistic altruism are adrift in our times. Rather, it is a search for a holistic knowledge framework that seeks to make whole that which was partial, incomplete, in large measure stunted, and therefore also stunting. The new framework to emerge involves principles that were present all along but unknown to us. It includes the old as a partial truth, and by its larger framework it transforms the traditional positions and the stubborn new observations, reconciling their apparent contradictions. It is common knowledge, for instance, that social sciences as taught at universities in general are based on Western theories. One of the challenges has therefore been to go about creating a relevant interpretation of Eurocentric-based models when working among African people. A dialogical search for integration, therefore, is compatible with legacies in which one group consistently deposits ideas into others, or that in which one narrow perspective, by default of historical factors, is made into what is not and cannot be. Dialogue cannot exist in the absence of profound love of the world and of people. The naming of the world, which is an act of creation and recreation, is not possible if it is not infused with love. It thus implies a coming to terms with the consequences of the prior arrangements whose inadequacies gave rise to the present imperative. The search is for a framework that will affirm, not deny, the integrity of all human beings, a framework that, by underscoring the notion of a genteel citizenry, can posit people not as perpetual victims or pawns, but as knowing subjects, irrespective of the knowledge frameworks within which they are located. The exclusivity that accompanied the rational and linear frameworks of Western knowledge has, in practice, meant that cosmologies that did not fit into the framework were dismissed and ridiculed. The cosmologies of other civilizations were submerged. The knowledge of other peoples, of women, and of all phenomena that could not be measured by the different scientific methods were all undermined or destroyed. In the vernacular version of this subjugation that came with colonialism, and later with modernization, the Western framework not only determined what was civilized, but also became the norm by which other consciousness is measured. The existential crisis to emerge from the realization that the value system on which so much knowledge is validated is itself so limited. It not only reflects but also perpetuates the same unbalanced worldview, and is moreover so unable to deal with diverse manifestations of modernization, which is central to the search for ways to consider establishing new holistic knowledge frameworks. As governments seek to transform their societies and empower local communities, the challenge becomes one of how to operationalize empowerment itself, in a context in which diverse knowledges are barely tolerated and exist only in sufferance and subjugative deference to a mainstream, essentially Western form of knowledge that is safely installed as the only way of seeing and the only tool by which the masses of humanity can receive accreditation and a license to be. The absence of flexibility and condescension towards other forms of knowledge in the institutions responsible for generating, validating, and dissemination of knowledge, even as the notions of human rights, of democracy, and of equality get writ large in constitutions, is truly disturbing. However, a profound cultural imbalance has resulted in the systems of academic, political, and economic institutions we see all around us. The emerging sense of disaffection. Increasingly, the chorus of disaffection emanating from scholars concerned with the basis upon which social reality of the whole world appears to have been constructed and that the deterministic reasoning and the totalizing theories of history are being heard. The contingence of the social and the historical, as well as the affirmation of the multiplicity of the worlds and forms of life, i.e. social heterogeneity and complexity, are being recognized and affirmed. It is also being recognized that forms of knowledge other than those sanctioned by science exist. These developments have led to a redefinition of the relationship between objectivity and representation, between subject and object, and led to the questioning of the status of scientific truth itself. The legacy of Western rationalism is no longer unchallengeably dominant, and its universal validity in particular is now under question. Decentered understanding of knowledge systems and other forms of universal conscience are emerging outside the exclusivist frameworks of Western modernity. Not only are questions about language and the production of arguments themselves emerging, the conditions for true statements and the modalities for understanding are now also on the witness stand. Feminists, postmodernists, and ecologically conscious paradigms of analysis have not only demonstrated but also confronted this taken-for-granted hegemony of Western knowledge. The degree to which reductionism has become so ingrained in the mainstream culture that it is often identified with the scientific method should be a matter of concern to all. The Cartesian partition, Werner Heisenberg wrote, has penetrated deep into the human mind during the 3 centuries following Descartes, and it will take a long time for it to be replaced by a really different attitude to the problem of reality. The total effect of these trends is to bring to bear a forceful return of philosophy to the social sciences and to the evolution of emergent, open, non-linear, and flowing spaces of information. Such is the strength of the new demands that it would appear that the legitimacy of the social sciences no longer rests in the obligation to produce objective knowledge alone, but also in the identification of a nexus between the development of knowledge and the transformation of societies. From the perspective of the production of knowledge, it is increasingly the case that sites for the production of knowledge on Africa and about Africa have to be subjected to interrogation and deconstruction in order to clear space for authentic participation by Africans in such an endeavor. It has, for instance, been noted that there is a deep feeling of alienation in relation to the social sciences with regard to the field's inability to relate to history on the one hand and to generate emancipatory power on the other. A development paradigm is an agreed school of thinking about how to view development and how to investigate and assess reality for the development of policy and action. The basic premise of the conventional development paradigm, however, is a hierarchical human spectrum in which some quarters are superior and therefore qualified to determine the other's development. A professional class of intellectuals serves these structures of organized domination by assessing, labeling, naming, and constructing knowledge and reality. However, the predominant focus on economic needs and economic poverty has led to a development discourse that is preoccupied with what the people do not have. This thinking is trapped in a negative dependency orientation that it generates, rather than motivating society to become constructively engaged in moving forward. If development is endogenous, however, then the people are the subject. They are not trapped in the cold condescending gaze of the rich upon the poor, because endogenous development begins at the point where people start to pride themselves as worthy human beings, inferior to none. And where such pride is lost, development begins at the point at which this pride is restored and history recovered. Yet the confluence between modern scientific knowledge, wealth, and power continues to privilege the exogenous model of development. Priorities in crop, livestock, and forestry research daily reflect a bias against the indigenous knowledge of rural people. It cannot be said enough that rural people's knowledge and modern scientific knowledge are complementary in their strengths and weaknesses. Combined, they can achieve what neither would alone. But for this combination of complementarity to occur, outside professionals have to step in humility down off their pedestals and sit down, listen, and learn. The present frameworks in which knowledge flows in one direction only, downwards, is not only disempowering, but also demeaning. The relations between knowledge systems. In seeking to move towards an IKS research agenda, the core strategy at the level of epistemology is to seek the best of both. Both the Western system and the IKSs represent national resources. The local contextual expertise and technologies that indigenous knowledge frames offer can complement some of the mechanical and technical precision capabilities of the Western knowledge systems to generate forms of creativity that benefit and empower everyone. But for this to happen, power must shift. Accordingly, the initiative seeks at a deep level to contribute to the emancipation, development, integration, and protection of IKSs. A process of dialogue through research should be central to such a methodology, in order to clarify the role of IKSs within human development. The emancipation of IKSs is a necessary condition for development. Development is crucial if they are to be integrated with other knowledge systems to achieve a holistic framework. Integration is crucial if IKSs are to fulfill their potential for contributing to human and social development in a rapidly changing global context. And protection is a strategy of vigilance against exploitation by dominant world forces. We also need to clear space in institutional and other policy arrangements for these diverse knowledges to exist and participate in unfolding modernization processes. By bringing in both the developing and developed countries, the intention is to signal the seriousness of the commitment to the agenda for dialogue on the issue of the transformation of the knowledge-generating fields at the global level, knowing uncomfortably so that having insisted on the authority of Western tradition throughout the colonial period in Africa, Europeans must join in and contribute to the relativization of its legitimacy. Within South Africa, continentally and internationally, there is a need to establish new research protocols and codes of conduct for scientific work. By initiating a critical reflection on the ethical questions surrounding research in the human and natural sciences, and to raise new research questions. In the years to come, such interventions should inform the overall framework of the National Innovations Fund and the National System of Innovations that have been established in South Africa. We need to generate and present debates and analyses on the internal and external characters of both IKSs and Western knowledge systems, separately and in relation to one another, with the objective of promoting strategies and terms under which their integration can be achieved. The contributions that Western knowledge has made to the development of science and technology is acknowledged. However, it is also recognized that, despite their internal fragmentation, Western knowledge systems have achieved world hegemony under subjugative colonialism and imperial relations. Conversely, indigenous knowledge systems have undergone mutations, have been subjugated, sometimes underdeveloped and exploited, but retain the potential for human and social development. Strategies for achieving the circular empowerment objective. These strategies will be achieved by positing public policy dialogue as dialogue between fields that problematizes the relationships between knowledge, power, and human development. The basic perspective follows from Gramsci, Foucault, and Freire, and has been articulated in the African context by Odora Hoppers as both a methodology and a strategy for ensuring informed participation and thus empowerment. This empowerment strategy involves at least 3 constituencies, be they at national or international levels: individuals and organizations in civil society, the scientific, especially the academic community, and policymakers. The scientific community is meant to include individuals based at universities, the academia in general, and science institutions. In the South African context, this would include science councils, but this also includes autonomous, authoritative, and influential persons in the academic or intellectual world who are able to contribute global or African perspectives on IKSs. The role of this constituency will be to interrogate and explicate the epistemological foundations of knowledge systems and the processes of knowledge generation that take place within these institutions. Policymakers in general refer to sectoral ministries. In South Africa, this would include the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee on Arts, Culture, Science and Technology that took the leadership through the National Steering Committee to conduct an audit of indigenous technology, as well as the efforts of all sectoral ministries. The role of policymakers will be to interrogate and explicate the epistemological parameters of current and emergent policy, specifically with reference to the relations between knowledge and power, and perceived limits to policy within existing parameters. The attention given to rural development in policy will be given a critical re-evaluation from the perspective of IKSs. This will help determine the extent to which IKSs as national resources are actively incorporated into development strategies, and the extent to which expertise in indigenous knowledge is accorded cognizance. Individuals and organizations in civil society may be drawn from constituencies presently defined as social partners in South Africa: business, labor, critical interest groups such as the Committee on African Renaissance, NGOs, and authorities in IKSs within communities. Their role will be to interrogate and explicate the links between epistemology, cosmology, and democratic participation, and to establish the new formula for fostering critical, self-reflexive praxis. At a higher level, the dialogue between these constituencies also signifies a dialogue between the fields of theory, practice, and policy. Fields are taken as discursive formations that are manifestations of knowledge and power domains. Reconstruction in the framework of the dialogue between fields implies disruption in order to create a higher-level basis for action and engender a more inclusive democratic practice that takes full cognizance of the plural manifestations of epistemology and cosmology. Disruption is regarded as essential to the contemplation of potential realities. Given the already dislocative nature of normal practice, the tendency to take Western hegemony as a given, and the general disinclination to interrogate the cosmology and the epistemology undergirding the social construction of reality at the moment for the majority of people who have experienced imperialist or colonial conquest. All three participant constituencies, the scientific community, civil society, and policymakers, need to engage with one another in all three fields, but with emphasis on and roles appropriate to their immediate concerns and potential contributions. The dialogue will deconstruct and reconstruct each field from the perspective of epistemology. The studies of micro-practices should lead to a reconstruction of theories, and to policy critiques and recommendations. A generative, open-ended language of description for dialogue within and across fields will evolve from an initial framework. It is proposed that cues need to be taken from the humanistic perspective that is determined to keep the human being firmly at the center of any research activity, aware that unless academic development or research work is consistently human-centered, it becomes vulnerable to all of the manifold forms of dehumanization that already abound in academic life. The humanistic perspective also desists from ahistorical analyses that conceal conservative standpoints under the guise of being value-free, rather to examine the contemporary as a reflection of the past and a guide for the future, and that without history, comparison becomes thin, shallow, and rootless. It views without enthusiasm the development of comparative method as a recondite activity for scholars and researchers who produce analyses, graphs, tables, and theories that are of interest only to one another, and sometimes only to themselves. Rather, to assail such parochialism and bring the depth of vision that a sense of the best can be found in humanity as a whole. Finally, it considers quite overtly the political nature of value systems, aware not only that the technocratic approach to valuations contributes to the domestication objective of learning, but also that what usually passes for value neutrality conceals powerful but hidden political conservatism. The notion of comparison in this initiative, therefore, seeks to bring perspectives, insights, and experiences from different contexts into a critical, reflective dialogue on the tenets of thinking and practice, and the potential for something qualitatively better to emerge. The cases that are referred to in this volume are introduced to reflect diversity and plurality. Participants in the initiative take cognizance of the limitations and dangers posited by the reductionist project of Descartes, in which objects of study are arbitrarily isolated from their natural surroundings and relationship with fellows, which in itself reflects a political choice aimed at controlling nature and the exclusion of other ways of knowing. Sandra Harding has characterized this Cartesian tendency as the contemporary alliance of perverse knowledge claims with the perversity of dominating power. The comparative aspect of this initiative would aim at examining the manner in which the exclusion of other traditions of knowledge by reductionist science is itself part of the problem at the ontological level, in that properties of other knowledges are simply not taken note of, at the epistemological level, in that other ways of perceiving are simply not recognized, even where they should, and at the sociological level, in that the non-specialist, the non-expert, is deprived of the right of access to knowledge and to judging claims made on its behalf. How then can modern science be regarded as signaling advance for humanity when it was achieved at the cost of tremendous silencing, parochial legitimation procedures, and most of all the deterioration in social status for most of humanity, including women and non-Western cultures? Critical emancipatory pedagogy. The insistence on a dialogical posture as a cumulative methodology, strategy, and objective in this initiative is aimed at reinforcing democratic and collective emancipatory values and practices by bringing key agents for change together in a coordinated program of research, analysis, planning, action, and reflection. As a methodology, it draws on policy studies, popular education, discourse analysis, and the sociology of knowledge in mapping principled procedures through which a dialogue within and between constituencies can set theories, policies, and practices on a considered transformative trajectory. Here the focus is on the epistemological dimension of emancipation, especially on the task of enlarging epistemic cognition, not only for previously subjugated groups but for all. For those who have internalized linearity in history and nature, taking guidance from other knowledge systems will seem like going backwards. For others who see plurality as the stable order for human societies and natural ecosystems, being enlightened by ethnoscience will amount to returning to the appropriate path after having gone astray for a while on the mechanistic road. It also extends what is often conceptualized broadly as culture or a cultural dimension to its epistemological and cosmological dimensions. There is an awareness in this project that the nationalistic thrust of the liberation struggles omitted to ascribe content to worldviews. This has resulted in a nationalistic backlash where the new bourgeoisie apply redress narrowly to leverage for individual gains rather than fight for ways of constructing reality that was at the heart of the infamous mind control strategy of colonialism. The project seeks to reposition what was called objects of research in a new dispensation, not just as sources of information meant for extraction, but as authorities in an epistemological domain that have been purposefully kept subjugated. By integration is meant going beyond finding an aggregate position or middle ground upon which the two knowledge systems will then enter into an ahistorical dialogue. It introduces the power and knowledge critique and analysis of the hegemony of mainstream knowledges in terms of their silencing effects, paying attention to their nature, potentials, omissions, and consequences. The initiative problematizes the tripolar link between intellectuals or academia, civil society, and the state or policy domain, and posits these in historical and geopolitical terms. In this framework, there is recognition of a dissonance in the application of dialogue in the Freudian sense of naming the world, and an under-articulation of strategies to enable the effective participation of African knowledge systems in this naming. Some questions that can be asked are, what role exists for the African civil society in the process of the social and cosmological construction of reality? How can civil society's role be enhanced in a context of social democracy to include the issue of metacognition and epistemic cognition? Within this framework, it is then possible to examine present limits to training and even to education in the sense of formal instructions premised on Western cosmology. More pertinently, it would be possible to closely examine what role a pedagogy based on a Western framework plays in complicating the child-parent relationship for a school-going child in African society. It would also be possible to draw the connection between what begins as an epistemological disjuncture at the early stages of childhood development, what matures into fundamental and existential alienation of persons processed through the Western cosmology, and their difficulty in later life with articulating their relationship with African civil society. The notion of competency could also be linked with identity and values that include the authority to speak and to act.